The grand reopening of the Veterans Table was set for a Saturday morning in early autumn, when the town's trees burned gold and the breeze carried the scent of change. The streets of Charleston Hollow, once slow and sleepy, now buzzed with something electric. People lined up before sunrise. Veterans in uniform, families with small children, teenagers who had only heard of John Carter through local legend but now whispered his name with respect. Michael stood at the entrance, sleeves rolled, tie off, clipboard in hand, helping volunteers hang the last of the bunting while his father sat nearby on a bench, watching it all unfold like a memory he'd never dared to hope for. Inside, the diner had transformed. Gone were the brittle booths and faded posters of the past. In their place, deep wooden tables engraved with names of local heroes, walls lined with photographs and handwritten notes from veterans across generations, a mural painted by a local artist showing hands of all colors breaking bread together. The menu remained simple: coffee, pie, breakfast staples, but every item came with a story. This grits recipe came from Miss Rabat Taylor, who fed half the Freedom Riders in '61, one card read. Another. Mac's omelet, named after Sergeant Malcolm Reed, who never missed a Sunday. But beyond food, it was the space that mattered. No one was turned away, no one was shamed, and for once people weren't just eating together, they were listening. Stories poured across tables, tales of war, of migration, of silent pain and louder triumphs. And in the center of it all was John Carter, now something of a living monument, though he didn't want that title. He greeted each guest with a nod or a handshake, but mostly he watched people come together in a way they hadn't before, watched what once divided them melt slowly in the warmth of pie and presence. Reporters came too, but John asked them to focus not on the scandal that birthed the diner's rebirth, but the conversations happening now. One camera crew caught a young white Marine, fresh from deployment, sharing stories with a black Vietnam vet. They laughed over hash browns, they cried over coffee. The moment went viral, donations poured in. Veterans across the country began mailing letters, photos, even old dog tags, asking them to be placed on the wall of honor being built at the back of the diner. And yet, not all was easy. Tom Harris's departure had left a wound in the town. Some locals still spoke in hushed disapproval, muttering about ruined tradition or outsider politics. But even those voices began to dim when they saw what rose in place of bitterness. One morning, just before opening, John found an envelope taped to the front door. No return address. Inside was a single line handwritten. "I was wrong, no name, no apology, but enough." He folded it gently and tucked it behind the register. As weeks passed, the diner became more than just a restaurant, it became a sanctuary. Young people came to volunteer, drawn by the mission, the stories, the energy. Retired teachers began offering free tutoring in the back room. A jazz quartet started playing on Sunday mornings. And one Tuesday afternoon, John spotted a face he hadn't seen in years. Tom's daughter, Rachel, stood by the mural, her eyes glassy. She didn't speak, just placed a photo of her grandfather, a Korean War vet, beneath the wall of names, then left. John didn't follow her, he just nodded quietly to himself. Michael's office in D.C. flooded with letters, not about policy or partisanship but gratitude. People asked how they could replicate the model, how they could bring a seat for every soul to their own communities. Michael drafted a bill, the Veterans Table Act, offering grants to small towns to build spaces that honored service and bridged division. When he delivered the proposal on the Senate floor, he spoke not as a politician but as a son. "My father once said peace only grows where injustice is uprooted," he told the chamber. "Let's dig deeper, let's plant something better." The bill passed with bipartisan support. But back in Charleston Hollow, none of that mattered more than the mornings John spent by the window, coffee in hand, watching people enter not with suspicion, but hope. One afternoon, a young man in a hoodie approached. Nervous, fidgeting, he asked if John had a moment. "Always," John said. The boy explained he was gay, estranged from his family, struggling with depression, but he'd heard about this place. Saw the videos and thought maybe, just maybe, he belonged here. John looked at him, soft and steady. "Son," he said, "you belong anywhere your heart still beats." The boy cried. John poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat together a long time. That evening, the staff added a new inscription above the entrance. It read, "If you have breath, you have a seat." Over the holidays, the Veterans Table hosted a community meal. People brought dishes from their own cultures: tamales, pho, collard greens, biryani, a patchwork of belonging. John raised a toast with his coffee cup. "To every soul, to every story, and to the tables we build between us." The crowd clapped and someone sang. It wasn't perfect. It was still a town with history, with wounds, but something had shifted. And as the new year dawned, Charleston Hollow wasn't just healing, it was leading. All because one man refused to be humiliated. All because his son stood up. All because they believed, in spite of the world, that dignity could be rebuilt one table at a time. Spring came early to Charleston Hollow the next year, painting the streets in soft hues of green and gold. The Veterans Table was now more than a diner, it had become the town's heartbeat. Schoolchildren came for field trips, learning about unity not from textbooks but from the living souls who sat at those tables. A group of elderly women hosted a knitting circle every Wednesday, making blankets for homeless vets. Retired mechanics offered free car checkups on weekends. And John Carter, still rising early despite the aches in his joints, was there almost every day, shaking hands, listening, welcoming new faces like old friends. The story of what happened at Tom's Diner had faded from national headlines, but here, its legacy continued in small, quiet revolutions. A black mother and a white police officer planned a fundraiser together. A formerly incarcerated man was hired as a line cook and earned back his dignity with every meal he served. People still talked politics, but now they did it over pancakes, not through shouting matches on screens. And slowly, the wounds of old betrayals, old divisions began to scab over. Not erased, but acknowledged, bandaged with action. Michael Carter visited monthly, blending public duty with private devotion. Every time he sat down with his father, he felt the weight of what they had started and the weight of what still had to be done. One Sunday afternoon, as rain tapped the roof in steady rhythm, Michael pulled out a notebook and handed it to his dad. "What's this?" John asked. "A memoir," Michael said, "or the start of one. I want you to write it." John chuckled. "I've never been much for writing. You've been living the story for over 70 years, Michael replied. "It's time the world heard it from your own words." So John began to write. Mornings before the diner opened, evenings when the air was soft and the porch creaked under the weight of thought. He wrote about war, not just the one in uniform, but the daily battles of returning home to a world that didn't feel like it wanted him. He wrote about love, about Margaret, their early days, the strength in her eyes, the way she made him feel like peace was possible even in chaos. He wrote about rage, about sitting in that diner, humiliated, heart bruised by betrayal. And he wrote about redemption, about the veterans' table, about seeing his son rise not as a politician but as a bridge. The pages filled slowly, then quickly, then all at once. The memoir, titled A Seat for Every Soul, was published in the fall. It became a quiet bestseller not for its prose but for its truth. Bookstores across America hosted signings. Libraries added it to their required reading shelves. High schools created discussion units around it. John Carter's voice, once stifled in the corner of a diner, now echoed in lecture halls and living rooms. But John himself remained grounded. When a publisher asked him what success felt like, he answered, "It feels like my granddaughter asking if she can bring her new friend to the diner because she wants him to feel welcome." That winter, John caught pneumonia. It came fast, as it often does for men who have carried too much for too long. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks. The entire town held its breath. Michael flew in, never leaving his father's bedside. Volunteers took over the diner, keeping it running with the same love and integrity. On the 13th day, John opened his eyes and said, "Did someone water the jasmine out front?" Michael laughed, tears falling freely. "Only you would worry about flowers at a time like this." "Flowers matter," John whispered. "They're the first thing people see before they come in." He recovered slowly but fully. And when he returned to the diner for the first time in months, the crowd that greeted him stretched down the block. The mayor declared the day John Carter Day. Church bells rang. Children held up signs that said "Thank you for your seat." John didn't speak that day. He just stood quietly, soaking it in, his heart full. That evening he sat on the porch with Michael again, this time under a sky so clear it looked painted. "You've changed this place," Michael said. John shook his head. "No, we all did, one story at a time." The next spring, another diner opened 2 towns over, inspired by the veterans' table, then another in North Carolina, then in Detroit, then in El Paso. Each one carried a plaque at the entrance, in honor of John Carter, who sat, who stayed, who stood, and wherever they opened, people came, not just to eat but to listen, to serve, to heal. One evening, long after closing, Michael found his father still at the counter, flipping through an old photo album. "I was thinking," John said, "about that day I walked out of Tom S. I almost didn't come back. Almost let hate have the last word." Michael sat beside him. "But you didn't." "No," John said, "because you showed up and because that girl spoke up, even if she sat back down. Courage starts in the mouth, son. But it finishes with your feet." Years passed, slowly, gently. John Carter lived to see his great-grandson born, lived to see a world that, while still imperfect, now had more tables than gates, more chairs than fences. And when his time came, it was a spring morning. The jasmine was blooming. The porch creaked one last time, and the sign above the door caught the early sun, shining on every letter. The veterans' table, a place for every story, a seat for every soul. Inside, the staff kept serving. Outside, the people kept coming. And somewhere in the gentle morning air, the spirit of an old man still sat at the third stool from the left, coffee in hand, smiling quietly as the world he believed in finally took its place. The old gray pickup truck rolled to a quiet stop along the sun-bleached road that cut through the heart of the southern town. The air shimmered with heat, rising from the asphalt in lazy waves. John Carter, an aging black veteran in his 70s with silver-flecked hair and a spine worn by decades of war and labor, pulled the door open and climbed out with a slow, practiced grace. His knees protested with every motion, but he kept moving, steady as the sunrise. The sign above the little building read, Tom's Diner, good food, better company. It had hung in that same spot for over 50 years, its paint faded by time, but its meaning still warm in the memories of many. For John, this diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was tradition. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he came for a cup of coffee and a slice of the best apple pie in the county. For years, it had been his quiet ritual, the same stool at the counter, the same creak of the doorbell above, the same nods and smiles from people who had seen him as a fixture in their town, even if they never truly knew him. But today, something was off. As John pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bells overhead echoed into a silence he didn't expect. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee still lingered in the air, comforting and familiar, but the hum of conversation had died the moment he stepped in. Every head turned, every voice fell, and in that breathless hush he felt something ancient and cold wrap itself around his chest. He nodded politely, trying to dismiss the tension as some odd coincidence. Maybe someone had dropped a plate. Maybe the power had flickered. Maybe it was just in his head. Soldier's instinct, he told himself. Too many years reading danger in shadows, but the silence didn't lift. He made his way to the third stool from the left, the one that had become his over the years, and sat down, slowly, carefully. The counter felt cooler than usual beneath his fingers. Then, from the kitchen doorway, Tom Harris emerged. Tom, the owner, a man John had known for more than a decade. He wasn't a close friend, but they'd exchanged holiday greetings, shared the odd story about their fathers and childhood mischief. Tom had once said, "You're the kind of man I wish my dad had been, John." That had meant something at the time, but now Tom's eyes didn't carry recognition. His smile, once casual and welcoming, was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. His brow furrowed, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and unfamiliar. "What can I get you today, John?" John blinked, unsure for a moment whether this was a joke. "Just the usual," he said gently. "Coffee and a slice of your famous apple pie." Tom didn't move, his knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of the counter. "We're out of pie," he said. John looked to his left, where a fresh pie sat behind the glass display, steam still fogging the inside. He smiled politely. "Looks like there's still a full one right there." Tom's voice rose sharply, slicing through the room like broken glass. "I said we're out. Matter of fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." John sat frozen. For a long second, his breath caught in his chest. He looked around the diner. Every eye was on him again, some wide with shock, others narrowed in shame or embarrassment. A few looked away. John slowly stood. "Tom, I don't understand." "Did I do something wrong?" Tom sneered. "You did plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my place. Now get out before I call the cops." The words didn't just sting, they tore through something fragile and deep. Something that had taken decades to build. For a moment, John wasn't in 2020 something. He was back in 1963, standing outside a restaurant in Georgia with a sign in the window that said "No coloreds allowed." But that was a long time ago, and this was Tom. John looked at him, trying to find any trace of the man he used to respect. But there was nothing left, just hate wearing the face of someone who had once nodded across the counter and asked about his grandkids. As John turned to leave, shoulders heavy, a young woman stood up from her booth. Her voice trembled. "This isn't right, you can't treat him like this." Tom spun on her, fury darkening his face. "This is my diner, my rules. You don't like it, you can leave too." And she did. She hesitated, then lowered her eyes and sat back down. Her courage had flared for a moment, but the weight of fear pressed her back into her seat. John stepped out into the sunlight, but it no longer felt warm. He walked to his truck like a man carrying a secret no one wanted to see. When he closed the door behind him, the silence inside the vehicle felt louder than the whole world. For a long while he didn't move. The steering wheel trembled in his hands. He had fought in wars, buried friends, held comrades as they took their last breath halfway across the world. He had watched his country struggle to keep its promise of equality, and he had waited patiently, faithfully, for the world to become better than it was. But now he sat outside a place that once felt like home, kicked out like a stranger, shamed like a criminal. He could leave, he could drive away, pretend it didn't happen, write it off as one man's ignorance. But something inside him shifted. He straightened, his breathing steadied, and deep behind his eyes a fire lit. Because John Carter was not just a veteran. He was not just an old man with a soft smile and a quiet way of speaking. He was a father, and his son, well, Tom Harris had just insulted the wrong man's father. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet office lined with legal briefs and campaign banners, Senator Michael Carter paused mid-sentence. His aide had just stepped in, eyes serious, voice low. "Sir, there's been an incident back home." Michael's hands stilled over a folder marked Veterans' Rights Initiative. He had been preparing for a press briefing, just another day on Capitol Hill, but something in the aide's tone made his stomach tighten. "What kind of incident?" The aide hesitated. "It's your father, sir. He was refused service. At Tom's diner, there's video and witnesses. They say it was racially motivated." For a long second, the world seemed to tilt. Michael's mouth went dry. He reached for the phone without another word. It rang 3 times before an old, familiar voice answered. Hello, Dad. Michael's voice broke with a mixture of love and fury. I heard what happened. Are you okay? There was a pause, then. I'm all right, son, just tired. It's been a long day. Michael closed his eyes, that voice so steady, so calm. The same voice that used to read him stories when he was 6, that taught him to stand tall when the kids laughed at his skin, his speech, his name. That voice should never have had to whisper through pain. I'm coming down, Michael said. This ends now. By the next morning, the whispers had grown into a storm. Outside Tom's diner, protesters stood in quiet defiance. Signs read no to hate, respect our veterans, dignity for all. Some had come from neighboring towns. Others were locals who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. Inside, Tom stood behind the counter, pretending the walls weren't closing in. He burned the eggs. He dropped a plate. He glared at every customer who dared to look at him too long. The phone rang off the hook, reporters, local activists, even an army-based chaplain demanding an explanation. But Tom clung to the belief that he'd done the right thing, that he was standing by principle. He didn't see a man he hurt, only a system he feared was slipping away. One where his father's voice still echoed in his ear, hissing about pride and bloodlines and who deserved to be served. Then the bell over the door rang. The room hushed. A man stepped in, dressed not in military green or hometown flannel, but in a tailored navy suit. He moved like someone used to being watched, like someone used to walking into rooms where the stakes were measured in more than coffee and tips. Michael Carter, Senator of the United States, son of John Carter. Tom's heart stuttered. Michael didn't sit, he didn't smile. He simply stepped up to the counter and said, "Are you Tom Harris?" Tom nodded stiffly. Michael's eyes were calm. But beneath that calm was fury, leashed, focused. "You refused service to my father yesterday, a decorated war veteran, a man who's lived in this town longer than this diner been standing." Tom puffed his chest. "This is my place. I serve who I choose." Michael nodded slowly. "On what grounds?" Tom faltered. "He made some people uncomfortable." Michael leaned in, his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "What made you uncomfortable, Mr. Harris? The uniform he wore, the medals he earned, or the color of the skin that bled for this country?" Tom's lips curled. "I don't need to explain myself to you." "No," Michael said, stepping back. "But you will explain yourself to the federal investigation we're launching into your discriminatory business practices, and the civil lawsuit my office will be filing, and the Veterans Alliance protest scheduled for this weekend, and the national news story you're about to become the face of." Silence, cold and heavy. "You made a mistake," Michael said, turning toward the door, "and you picked the wrong man to humiliate." Tom's knees wobbled. He reached out for the counter to steady himself, but the edges had already started to blur. Because for the first time in his life, Tom realized that the world wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving forward, with or without him. Across town, John Carter sat quietly on his porch, watching the sunlight bend through the trees. He held a photograph of his late wife, Margaret, her smile soft, her eyes bright, her memory eternal. "I wish you could see him, Maggie," he whispered. "Our boy a storm, and he's gonna clean this town." Michael joined him just before dusk. No cameras, no reporters, just father and son side by side. "I didn't want this," John said softly. "I didn't want it to become a war." Michael nodded. "I know, but sometimes peace only grows where injustice is uprooted." They sat in silence for a while. The air was thick with jasmine and old wounds. Then Michael said, "Dad, what if we bought the diner?" John turned. "What? I mean it. I've already spoken to some folks. The place is struggling. Tom's in more debt than he lets on. What if we took it and turned it into something better?" John raised a brow. "You want to run a diner?" Michael smiled faintly. "No, I want to rebuild a town, one table at a time." John laughed for the first time in days. "That's the most Carter thing I've ever heard." By the end of the week, Tom received an envelope under his door. Inside, a formal offer to buy the diner. It was more than fair, nearly double the market price. The only condition, he leave. Quietly, immediately, no reopening, no rival establishment. Just gone. Tom stared at the letter for a long time. It smelled like finality. It tasted like shame. He wanted to tear it up. He wanted to shout. He wanted to crawl back into the time when his father's world still made sense. But that time was gone, and somewhere in his chest something cracked open. A silence that begged to be filled. Days later, the town awoke to a surprising sight. The diner, once bearing the name Tom's, now had a new sign being installed, the Veterans Table. Below it, in smaller letters, a place for every story, a seat for every soul. Standing in front of the glass, watching the workers put up the letters, was John Carter. His shoulders were still bent, his hands still trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, but in his eyes was something powerful, not revenge. Not bitterness, but purpose, because some wounds don't just need to be remembered, they need to be rewritten.